So what I'm going to do today is what I do for families, to try to begin them thinking somewhat differently about their child's behaviour, so that they get a better chance to think about different ways to respond rather than habituated ways of reacting. Because I think that's usually what happens under pressure. So that's what I'll cover, and you can ask me questions as we go to clarify, even though you know this really well.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's good. So, and just to give an example actually, so I know someone that has a 5-year-old and his behaviour at the moment is really quite out of control, in that, you know, he throws things at the teachers, he gets sent home from school, he struggles to manage his anger for such a little kid. And one of the conversations I've been having with her is around, you know, how do you respond at home to this experience but still let him know that he's loved and he's a part of a positive family life. And one of the things I was thinking of is, like I said to her, you know, in the afternoon, you might still want to take both your boys out for ice cream, and not that you're rewarding the bad behaviour, but thinking about it as I'm trying to make our family life still work.
Yeah.
When I think what happens is sometimes these things go on at school, and then at home people feel they also need to keep punishing their child for something that is really, for the most part with this child, I think, outside of his control.
It's a really good question and a really good example of most of the time what happens is not understanding the child's experience in a way that you can do both those things. So let them know that certain stuff's not okay and that they're loved at the same time. The Circle of Security has this phrase, description of parenting, as bigger, stronger, wiser, kinder. And I think the problem is when we move into a place where we're working on behaviour that's unhelpful, unacceptable, we don't know how to be bigger, stronger, wiser, kinder. All that comes to mind is cranky, punitive, because that's likely to be what happened to us. And or we're embarrassed, and or we're disappointed, and a whole range of negative affects around us, and we think we've got to give them a lesson in a way. So you behave in a certain way, you punish, that will change the behaviour. Sadly, that doesn't necessarily work. And you can still let a child know things aren't okay and love them. It's about something I talk about is, when do you give the life lesson? Like, when do you let a child know that this sort of stuff's not helpful? Most people think they do it in the moment. That's really not going to work real well. And when they do even think of it in the moment when it's low, they don't think about the affect level and how to deal with that before they give them life lessons, because if the child's affect goes up, then their availability cognitively is really marginalised. Whereas helping them with their affect, in a sense, brings their ears online, brings their brain online, so that you can talk about it. It's unhelpful. And I think that's another useful word over and above the interpretation of behaviour. Good or bad is unfortunately the thing that's thrown around. Naughty. Whereas when we talk to kids about helpful and unhelpful, they really can get it. So coming back to your question, that is a really interesting dilemma. It happens a lot. Something about school's hard, so I behave in a way that will help me avoid or is letting people know I struggle. Teacher reports to parent, child's being naughty. Parent thinks, what do I do about that? Do I punish them again? Really unhelpful, because when you're 5, it doesn't make sense. It just seems that I'm in jail most of the time, and when I'm in jail I may as well just keep it going. There's nothing to be gained or lost. So yeah, I don't know if I've answered that, but it's really finding language that says, let me tell you something else. So when that child arrives home and when he's picked up, the first thing that usually happens is, tell me about your day, or how was your day? Which for a little one like that is like, what do I say? All I was naughty. And I've heard it. How was your day? Well, I didn't do X, that wasn't bad. just to say to a child, it's good to see you, starts a whole different dialogue. It's good to see you, I missed you. You can imagine that child feels held and contained and loved, and then you can have a conversation about stuff in a different way.
So maybe we should start at the brain stuff, about what happens for adults particularly, and what happens for kids when
Draw it. So let's do the brain. Here's the brain of the child. And
I'm going to hold it.
yeah. Lots of people hear of this. We talk about fight, flight, freeze. It's almost throwaway. Yeah, the fight, flight, freeze reaction. Let's put it in a context. And we know that fight, flight, freeze is driven by this part of the brain, the amygdala, but it doesn't have to really be known. Let's put it in context. Structurally, the brain is probably the same structure as it's been for 5 to 10,000 years. I know that's a big call. So, and what it was highly adaptive around was surviving in a time when, as a species, we should have died. It goes back to when we were hunted. And this fight, flight, freeze is really activated in the face of threat. Yeah? And that's really helpful. It's important in the face of threat. A long time ago, the child was able to alert the parents that they were there while the parents were worried about the threat. Today, the same mechanism exists. The context's changed. The thing, and I'm being facetious, but let's say that the saber-toothed tiger is now replaced by, no, you can't have your iPad. It's actually, that can be for kids enough to set off a threat response that has fight, flight, freeze, and you get what we call meltdowns or tantrums. The context of the alert has changed. It might even be, for example, at school, a demand. In an area where I'm not strong, I can start to feel threatened by the demand, which for a busy kid, someone whose body's constantly moving, whose system is already on alert, we might call them someone with ADHD, to ask to sit still might have a physiological response that's similar to threat. So the system goes into this really quickly. Their kick-off point. Here's the kick-off point. Typical kids floating around here occasionally do that. When I'm busy, when things are hard, when I'm vigilant, for whatever reason, I'm floating around here. It doesn't take much for me to have the threat system activated.
And that can be also in the classroom. I think teachers can, teachers' own moods and attitudes can create that vigilance, right?
Yeah. Well, I was just reading some papers recently about coercion and the interactive nature of coercion, that it's a dual relationship, that children endeavour to coerce and adults endeavour to coerce. And when you bring up children, teachers and parents, there is another brain that is similarly structured in the interaction. And in this brain, same system, the threat actually becomes the child. Disruptive, and you've got 25 kids if you're a teacher, if you're a parent, disruption starts to head off your alert system. So the child eventually activates this system, moves to a position where it says, you need to stop because I'm feeling unsettled. We don't say that to ourselves, that's the physiological, neurological response. The thing that then happens, and this is oversimplified, so here's the child behaving. The thing that happens is once that child is experienced, not perceived, experienced as a threat, and we all have our thresholds. So an angry child could kick you off sooner than me, but sooner than someone else. This system says to the prefrontal cortex, which is the place that conduces good thinking, you need to stop this. You need to work out how to stop this because I'm feeling really distressed. And those signals head off at a very, very fast pace. A metaphor I often use with parents is Autobahn in Germany, no speed limits, you're in a Porsche. Because this is saying to this, you need to fix it so we feel safer, we, this entity. So instead of looking that way, in a sense, this starts to loop. I need to find ways to fix it. Naughty corner, you need to. So all of these things, the mechanisms which come into play to manage the behaviour, are often about this sense of I need to calm things down so I feel better, rather than, for example, what is the child telling me with their behaviour right now? It's more like they're just out of control. They've got this, so we use all of the definitions, whether diagnostic or naughty or whatever. And so to break this, to put a stop sign between these, so this is a reaction.
Yeah.
And what we've got to try to do is, in the face of a physiological reaction that's highly adaptive, well-tuned, been very successful for 100,000 years, find a way to interrupt it so that the reacting is interrupted for long enough for us to mount a response. And I know it sounds like I'm splitting hairs. I think responses are a very different mechanism. Responses that come from this mechanism here, that is doing a lot of data gathering, that is doing a lot of context analysis. This is doing, we need to stop this. And there's an overly simple way, which nobody ever thinks to do, and that's to do with the vagus nerve, which is one of the 10 cranial nerves. It leaves the brain. It's it's the only one actually, and one of the places it goes is the diaphragm. And I don't know if you noticed, but when you do get tense, your diaphragm gets tense. Taking a breath has been shown to activate the vagus nerve, which introduces an anti-stress hormone, and you get a stop sign on that, which allows this to start engaging. Very hard to do when it's a threat, because this system is driving that I need to survive right now. Yeah?
Yeah. So it's this notion that actually as kids escalate, teachers need to de-escalate, and one of the ways they can do that is by just stopping and breathing. And in fact, the situation is probably going to go better if you do nothing rather than do something. If all you do is stop and watch and breathe rather than, and I think that's when, like when people will grab a child not meaning to, or point or physically get in their space, and I think that tends to be in those moments. It's a non-thought.
Yeah, let me just show you something else that's really valuable. That when we know that a child under adolescent, children and adolescents are incredibly tuned to facial expressions and tone of voice. So even this question, what's wrong? That face is ambiguous. It can be threat. So the child thinks, wow, it's really hitting the fan. I'm in real trouble. And it might be a genuine wanting to know what's wrong, but because it's generated on this sort of level, it's this facial expression and tone of voice and the finger or the hands all demonstrate to a highly activated threat system. This is getting harder. The other thing is that the child doesn't understand that the adult is concerned. They just think something's wrong. We expect children to understand that when mum and dad are worried about the car at home and they're talking about the car in sort of elevated tone, the child may think something's wrong. They will not think mum and dad are talking about the car necessarily, and can get elevated. And that phenomenon is being shown in some interesting studies that show pre-adolescent children are much more attuned to facial expression than adolescent children. It's something that changes with the major neurological reorganisation that occurs at adolescence.
Interesting.
So and there's a lot of material now coming through. It's really hard. It's hard on parents, it's hard on teachers, it's hard on anyone. The staying still and calm, what the child experiences is nobody's panicking. And they start to regulate, because children are dependent on adults for a regulation process. We forget that too when we talk about, well, we need help. We need to get this child regulating. They need to regulate themselves. Very, very hard when you're 5. What you do is you're scanning the environment for someone who's looking calm, an adult who's looking calm, because you're, again, adaptively oriented to where's the calm person. If the adult's panicking, then the system of thinking is it must be really bad, something dangerous is going on, I will escalate further. It's so simple to think through, really hard to do. And I think the other thing is, once the breath is taken, is finding language other than language that comes to mind, which is usually questions, which is usually a lack of a reflection of the child's experience emotionally. You might say, why? Well, because their arousal level, Yerkes-Dodson, the child's over-aroused. You want them to come back to a calm alert state so that they can take in information. How do you get them to a calm alert state? You reflect their current state. Just quickly, when people are in this state and you say they're not listening, they cannot listen. The adaptive function is, I don't need to hear the wild animal, I need to see where it is. So the whole physiology focuses towards the eyes and the ears switch off. So the teachers are saying, listen to me, child's saying, my system's not listening, I'm terrified, and that face looks really scary. You can see the system's off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That neutral face thing is really interesting, and I'm sure harder for some people.
It's very hard.
Than others, you know, that look of worry, you know, people look worried or concerned all the time.
And I think it's hard because it's not a malevolence, it's just a humanness. And so what we're asking ourselves to do is interrupt a mechanism that's several thousands of years old that worked really, really well. The context is so different now, and it's interesting talking to parents about this, because when you introduce the idea of the thought, you need to stop now because I'm feeling uncomfortable, they smile, they know. And I suspect teachers do. There are times when you think, this kid needs to stop now because I'm really feeling it. Even if they don't, their body's tight, they're getting all of this sort of physiological impacts of higher levels of stress, which means this system is activating, this has been compromised, my ability to move. And I'm sort of segueing a bit, but what they'll move to is something we will cover here. They just keep saying, why are they doing that? And look for explanations, because they're, instead of thinking, for example, what is this child telling me?
And I think this is a real change, even in certainly in the last decade in education. This notion of behaviour as communication. I think you see it more and more across written documents when that wasn't always true.
And it is when we talk about behaviour and we write up behaviour is communication, it seems a bit passé, doesn't it? Yes, of course it is. Except as we get older, we have these sort of statements. Communication's 80% non-verbal, and then we completely ignore it because we're dominated by this thing. And I don't want to get too philosophical, but I've said to you, I think I've said this to you, it's a pity we don't conceptualise ourselves as people that breathe rather than people who think. Because if we thought about ourselves as people who breathe, we'd be more worried about the breath than what this thing is telling us is going on. So we talk about behaviour as communication, which makes sense. You and I can sit here now and go, yeah, until a child is dysregulated, and then, because this is activated, this is where behaviour is communication resides. It doesn't reside there, that thought lives there. The other thing that we talk about, as you know, is behaviour is connecting, it's driven by connecting. We're much more comfortable saying attention, they want my attention, except we usually say it like this, they want my attention, as if it's a burden. Children are driven to attend. Children are driven to connect because that's how they develop. That's how they feel safe. What we reframe this, as you know, is into helpful connecting and unhelpful connecting. The semantics are really critical because all of a sudden a child has gone from naughty and good to that's helpful, that's unhelpful, and curiously they thrive when given that reference point themselves. That's really helpful. Everyone says to me, I start using that word and I'm getting lots of really positive behaviour that I just can't believe. And the unhelpful, you don't shift to this paradigm of shame. The child doesn't start to conceptualise themselves as bad, which when you get it repeatedly from 3, 4 and 5, it's a well-developed paradigm. And there's a lot of really interesting research on the conceptualisations of child as difficult, which is another thing that can happen as a consequence of behavioural challenges. Difficult child definitions are seen to increase punitive behavioural strategies, which has the effect of increasing difficult behaviour. It's a loop. Yeah? The other thing is we talk about that's pertinent is that it serves a purpose. And I'll say to parents, and that's not to push your buttons, even though it feels like it. And again, behaviour serves a purpose. Most often we go to the sort of negative, willful, getting a good outcome, getting a bad outcome, pushing buttons. It is about regulation. My body, my mind, my sense of well-being is under threat or under demand or having fun. I tend to behave as a consequence of that. We, as we get older, we cognitively mediate that. We still behave our way out of it, but we're able to say that was a good idea. It was a good idea not to go out because I'm anxious. When you're a child and anxious is a physiological experience. It's a disquiet in my body that says I'm now under threat, I need to get out of here. It serves purposes, and it's not about manipulation, it's about learning history. This works, I'll keep doing it. It's not always under threat, it's when I'm having fun.
And it strikes me today, thinking about this, that if as an adult in a room and you have a child that has lots of unhelpful behaviours, and even if I personally think that if you are able to stay calm and patient and put in place some of these strategies, right? Not questioning, leaving the talking until a later time when their system is not so activated. But even if nothing changed about the child's behavior, with you doing all these things, your experience as an adult of that child and of your competency in these moments would be so much better. And for the rest of the children in the room, it would be calmer. So it might be that they say, oh, sometimes, Andreas doesn't have such a good day, or, these things happen. But the bigger issue is quite often these things happen, and when they aren't managed, although I know that's not the wording that's used anymore, it just becomes like, a four-ring circus in the classroom where everybody is disrupted, and, it's unsettling for the other kids. The adults are really activated, everybody's up in arms.
And so the whole system, the context, and we come over here, anti-scene thinking.
Which is very stressful.
Yeah. I think the thing I add here is context is crucial. The context in which it's going on. I also think it's really important when you said Andreas is having a difficult day. When I do this with parents now, and in a couple of recent presentations, is just stop and say, I want you to imagine what it's like being your child. What's it like being Andreas in that moment? And there's been some very moving comments made. The one that I found and still find the most moving was when a dad who was quite emotional was talking about his 6-year-old who has a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. He said, my hunch is it's like he's in the centre of the cyclone where it's calm, and if he ventures anywhere near that huge chaotic movement that surrounds him, he must be terrified. And it's really interesting to have seen how that dad has now progressed by thinking about the experience of the child. So Andreas is having a difficult day is a far preferable perspective that he's just a bad kid. Even more, if you could say, I wonder what's happening for him today, what's he telling me about his day? Then it might be enough to say to Andreas, tough day, it's busy. And what happens then is, by creating meaning, and there's a really important component of adult-child, which is about creating meaning, because my hunch is Andreas doesn't have a clue what's going on. What he does know is, I don't feel right.
Yeah.
And I need to move and act and yeah.
And probably, if you, as you get to know kids, you see it on their face when they come in, and to know, if you need some quiet time today, you just let me know. It's fine. If you need to go and work by yourself, in the library corner or whatever, is giving children the opportunity to have a bit of direction about where their bodies are. I mean, is that a helpful thing?
I think you've got a real dilemma. You think the thinking is helpful. The thing is if part of the disquiet is the demand of school, the task, then giving them the option of opting out. It's tricky because they will take it. So I think that Andreas turns up and you notice he's not feeling crash hot. The first step is just the observation. Hold back what you might be able to do. And depending on age, if he's 5, he's forgotten what you've said. Because I don't mean to be facetious, but Andreas comes in as a 5-year-old and you say to him, things are a bit tricky. Just for example, tricky today. Yeah? Andreas gets that, and then we go, if you need to take a break, you can.
Right.
That's highly likely what happens to a 5 to 9-year-old. That doesn't mean the idea of taking a break isn't there. It means that Andreas comes in, looks a bit tricky today in your own head. Hey Andreas, things are a bit different today. Just scanning, notice escalation. You can take a break now. You actively manage him.
Yeah.
What does he learn? He learns, somebody's got my back, somebody's noticed, and when I feel this, taking a break's a good idea. Giving me the option of taking a break is more likely to fall into that category and/or, good way to avoid the demand.
Yeah, and I guess I was thinking about a child that came in one morning through a chair. It was like Monday morning, first thing, and the uproar that caused. And I had happened to see the social worker's report on this child, which was basically like, this child lives in a home with no furniture, and it was a cold place. It wasn't a warm place, and I sort of could imagine that he'd spent this weekend at home where there were very little routine. And by the time he came, this was a kid whose behaviour increased over the week, and then Monday was always the hardest day for whatever reason. So I guess it's also about knowing the child, what is the bit that might be causing the escalation as well. Is it, the demands, because some kids are fine until you put demands on them and then they fall about, versus, they come in still really escalated from...
Probably a routine that morning where they were being under enormous pressure to get organised for somewhere they didn't want to go. So getting ready for school when school's a tough place, coming to a therapy session when therapy's hard work. I'll do lots of resisting, and parents won't regulate me. What they'll do is rush me. And so when I get here, I need to cash it in. Instead of the car, the bigger, stronger, wiser kind of stuff of, a bit tricky today, early on. You can do this, you can do that, reducing the input of language and questions, and understanding that this is not a child who's just being a pain in the butt, it's a child who's saying, I'm finding it hard this morning to get ready for school because school's a bit scary. People have an understandable sense. Why would you say you're a bit worried about school today to a child who's already worried about school? It's because they aren't thinking I'm worried about school, they're thinking I feel like I'm freaking out. Making the link is like, and when an adult says you're a bit worried about school in this tone, the message is, I'm not worried about it. Child, they're not freaking out. Maybe my worries are unfounded. This is fundamental attachment theory. But what we're doing is we're bringing language to it at a time when it's very useful, as opposed to when in pre-verbal times it's really easy to regulate babies. There's something about their lack of language that allows us to read them non-verbally beautifully. Then something goes pear-shaped when they grab language. We start to believe what they're telling us.
Yeah.
Which is the next part of this that's really salient, and that is, let's think about language in this context. In other words, instead of having the experience of believing that a 6-year-old is telling you something factual, you wonder what might be underneath it. And these are trite. You're not my friend anymore, to mums or dads or to other people. As I say to everybody goes, yeah, he doesn't mean that or she doesn't mean that, they mean they're cranky. Yeah, except in the moment when your amygdala is running right, your prefrontal cortex is looped out, and you find yourself in a 20-minute discussion with a child that was about behaviour to avoid, to regulate, rather than, you're cranky with me because I'm not letting you do what you want. Too bad, you're not my friend anymore. And sometimes, for parents, it can actually hurt their feelings. When your child says, I hate you, mummy, it can be easy to be hooked by that and say, that's not a very nice thing to say to you, mum. You know how much I love you. Understandable. What the child is really saying is, you're not giving me the damn iPad. We do it as adults. We use language in all of our surreptitious, sneaky, non-meaning ways. Relationships, you should know what I'm thinking. Really helpful. What they're saying is, I'm cranky with you. For some reason, we lose sight of that when a 6-year-old is saying, I need to go to the toilet, and you know they went 5 minutes before. Instead of having something just got hard, I think you're a bit worried about what's happening next. We're off to the toilet again. Learning experience for child is, that worked. I must remember that phrase. That is not them being manipulative, that's them being a child.
I used to go to the sick bay a lot at school. That was my avoidance strategy.
Yeah, and it saves a lot of time, and also it saves a lot of energy. We talk also of this, as you know, the fuel tank metaphor. This resonates with people really well, and it's one of the shortest descriptions of attachment theory you'll ever see. And I'd ask anyone to think about when they're driving their car and the red light comes on. Bee's getting some water now. When the red light comes on, what's it feel like? You need to answer. Most people say they get anxious. Some people say they get really worried. For kids, they thrive on the fuel of parent or adult. They need it, it's crucial. They can't read the fuel gauge. And often, most of the time, what happens is this red light comes on and they turn up. This is a bit of a cliche, usually when mum's cooking, child turns up in kitchen, mum says, what do you want, I'm busy. Child doesn't know their fuel gauge is empty, they just know they need mum. She's absent. If in that moment you could think to say, you've come to say hello, and you can go play, you're actually filling the fuel tank. This metaphor is useful because, for many reasons. One, much like fuel tanks, some children have smaller tanks than others. Some children are more efficient in an engine context than others. And all children suffer from the same thing as cars. When there are traffic jams, they use a lot more fuel than when they're on the highway. And one of the first places they encounter traffic jams is school. It's a very high demand on me, and I'm very inefficient at fuel usage. The other thing that I've added to this recently can also explain behavioural spikes, which usually a phenomenon what happens when we change a response to a child, and what they do is the thing they used to do more frequently before it dries away, and it's because they're used to going to the BP service station, and we've changed the account to a Shell service station.
Yeah, I think that is a thing for teachers to really keep in mind, that usually when they've decided they're going to try your strategy, whatever it is, I would expect that you get an increase in the behaviour then before you get it to drop away.
Always. It's a human thing, a behavioural spike, well researched. Yeah, just think of it that way. Oh, they're used to going to the Shell petrol station, they don't realise the account's been changed. They'll get it if you stick with it. And this is one of my favourites. People say, depending, there's lots of myths around how long does it take to change behaviour. The most common one I hear is 6 weeks. And if it doesn't, it's usually because people are using a rolling 6-week strategy. They don't do the same thing every day for 6 weeks. They do it one day, then maybe 2 days, then maybe 3 days, then they forget. So they actually start again, particularly with a child. And with children, they're like, let's talk about behavioural elements of reinforcement. The unexpected, unpredictable, non-timed reinforcer is the most powerful. That's why poker machines work really, really well. So let me put it another way. You do the thing you want to do to get the change behaviour 100 times in a row, and then do it once the other way, you're back to square one. And I'm exaggerating to some extent. Nothing ever is really extinguished in the behavioural sense. We talk about extinguishing behaviours. It's still there. Maybe there's a tiny dim light somewhere in the neurology. It's still available under enormous stress. So don't be surprised when it turns up.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of an example, a clear example. The only one I can think of is really with bedtime, which we have with parents, right? They want their kids to go to bed. Bedtimes are unbearable, and as you say to families quite often, it'll take 2 weeks, but actually if they do it consistently, it takes like 3 nights before kids realise if they come out of their room, they're not going to get it.
Yeah, they're not going to get the fuel. They're not going to get what they want. So, and this is a good example of changing language. It's time for bed rather than are you ready for bed? It's time for sleep. When the door opens, there's nothing. It's like time for bed, time for sleep. No neutral, in, you're out, out. Parents sit, as soon as they sit, they're gone. As soon as they stay, they're gone. Child comes out, same, neutral response, time for bed. You're right, the best has been 3 days. With chronic sleeping in bed with parents as well. These things are, while some of them are culturally bound, what we're unconsciously telling kids is it's not a safe world. And when you don't think it's a safe world, then the speed with which your amygdala activates is faster than if you think it's a safe world. Because your alert system is modified, mediated. I think the other thing that's really important on this side of the equation is everyone knows about consequence management. Let's talk about some of the really tricky bits. We know of positive reinforcement.
Okay, so that's when you do something to increase a behaviour.
Yeah.
You
well
add
done.
something
Good
and
job,
it increases
Chris. Yeah.
behaviour.
The thing is really important, particularly in an education setting, is good job over good girl or good boy. Because some of the research is showing that good job, good work, focus on the task, increases the willingness to persist and try again and continue. When it's often hyperbole, that's awesome, that's great. When you're 4 and somebody says that's awesome, one of 2 things comes to mind, if they actually came to mind. Why would I do it again? It's already awesome. And the second one is, why would I do it again? It might fail. Now, there are some children that isn't necessarily applicable to, but generally speaking, be conscious of this hyperbole. There's everybody today is excellent. Really? And what's the downside of that is if I don't think I'm going to crash hot, then I'm not going to try again. I've already been excellent once. I'm going to risk losing it. These sorts of things are getting a bit lost. The negative reinforcement, lots of people think they know what it means. I don't want to
This is the pernicious one.
Yeah, this is the nasty that comes from...
So that's when you take away something and it increases the behaviour.
Yeah, that's the clinical definition. Let me show you how it works. And this is how it resonates with people in 3 words. No, no, yes. In whatever form you want to take it. Parent, teacher, no, you can't have it. No, you can't have it. Okay, you can have it. That is when it's pernicious. And it happens insidiously and in tiny, tiny bits of need to get something done, under pressure, busy life, context. This bit is the tough bit, the no-no. Sometimes it's worth saying, yes, you can have your iPad, before they're even asked. It's the no-no that the child learns that the behaviour that's associated with no-no is the one I use to get what I need or what I want. And and the negative reinforcement increases the frequency of undesirable behaviour, and it relieves the teacher and parent of pressure.
So, I mean, I think that when a child comes asking for something, my thought about this is you can say yes or you could say no, but once you've said whatever you've said,
Stick with it.
Stick with it.
Yeah.
And even if later you change your mind, have it as a separate event.
Yeah.
So you can have the iPad now 20 minutes later, not when they're begging for it.
Yes, not when they're behaving for it. Let's call it behaving for it negatively. Now, you touched on something then that we'll talk about in a sec. How do you say no when we now know that no actually is likely a system that activates? The last bit of this consequence management is the neutral response, which we've talked about. Most people think neutral is, I'm going to leave you there. You're in the naughty corner, or I'm leaving. The leaving is problematic because it increases fear. Neutral is, I get it. I can see, understand, appreciate what it is you want, and I'm just going to be here, and it's not happening. The leaving exacerbates fear. Lots of people think you can settle, you're not having it, and they leave. Child moves from being disappointed to being afraid. This is very valuable and very hard to muster.
So this is a time where you would do the you're okay.
Yeah, you're safe, I'm here. Because this brings us to the, so let's just come to the antecedent side. So these are the things, most of us live in that world.
Behaviour consequence world.
Yeah. And then we introduce this really fun one. If, dreadful word in the management of children, if you blah, you can have, do, blah. Sounds like a good idea. It's contingent, right? You're making things contingent. Get rid of if and put first. First this, then this, and you've taken away contingency and you've made it a temporal relationship. Really important, because the child learns it's a sequence, not a contingent. So they don't move to, wait a second, everything I do I get something, that's going to work really well for me. In fact, I'll start using it back.
And that's actually something we've seen. I can think of a child that basically what's happened in their household, right, is everything is a if, then, and so he will only now, if they want him to do anything, he'll basically say, I'll do this if I can have this, or if I can get that.
Yeah. And even if they say, first I'll do this, then I'll do that, it's a much better relationship between the two outcomes than the contingent one. Because the parent can then say, let me think about that. First do this, then that. Because usually the child will put, first I'll have ice cream, then I'll do the chores. Yeah, okay. Let's do it this way. First the chores, then the ice cream. By the way, one of the things that I find fascinating is how people will actually do first the ice cream, then the chores. It's like, that's not going to work real well for you. But the child is demanding the ice cream. Child demands Play-Doh. This is a real example. Teacher wants work. They will say, okay, get the Play-Doh and then you can do the work. There's nothing in it for me. First work, then Play-Doh is going to work for the child. Especially if it's done calmly and preemptively before this line's hit.
Yeah.
So let's come back to the antecedent management, which everybody, again, calls triggers. The thing about triggers is there's another human component that gets introduced unhelpfully, which is hope. So a parent may know, or a teacher may know, that when that person turns up to school, 99 times out of 100 they will do this, and when they turn up they think, I hope they don't do that today.
We're going to hope every day that it's the one day it doesn't happen.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of saying, I know when they arrive they're usually wound up, and when I see them, because this is going, blah, this says, I know, let's hope it doesn't happen. And in that moment, I feel better for a second, but I've completely lost any capacity to bring an observation to that little one's face. So triggers are overcome by hope most of the time, even though we like to think we think of triggers. And often triggers, we don't go far enough back. We don't go back to what happened 3 or 4 times before the event we're managing. Yeah? We think, what happened just before that? No, that doesn't make sense. What happened before that? What happened before that? Ah, there it is. And you equip yourself with a catalogue. That makes that a lot easier. I think a much more helpful way to think of antecedents is the context in which the child operates, their experience, and I say this to parents all the time, this is not to build a whatever you want, you get. It's far from it. Most of the folks who come here say this is actually far more containing and controlling than I've ever done, even with my loud nose and lots of yelling. I'm really telling them these are the parameters in which we're going to operate. And the child is saying, oh.
There's comfort in that, right?
There's huge comfort in that. There's some really interesting studies that talk about the laissez-faire parenting versus the punitive parenting. Most disturbingly, children from a laissez-faire parenting situation and children from a punitive parenting situation both have difficulties. The child is demanding control. You give them control, they're terrified. You terrify them, they're terrified. Children are not meant to have control, and they demand it regularly. Really important to remember.
Yeah, and it is interesting back, and some of this really comes out of, for adults that really struggle with some of this, it's, their own, I want to be liked. If I set boundaries, if I say no, they won't like me.
And I think in even more, what's the word? Poignantly, when you have a child who has a learning difficulty, a developmental delay of any sort, you don't want them to suffer. And so you unconsciously make choices about their lives, that when you can give them something of joy, you do it. Because I think, and this is I've had more than one mother say this to me, I think it's my fault. I don't want them to suffer more than they already are, which is tragic and painful and true. And you probably know the session where we had a mum who was helping her little boy she did everything for him until he got to school, and then it was really hard for him because other kids didn't care about the teachers. They were easily managed through the occasional tantrum, but the other kids, it was really heartbreaking. They wouldn't play with him. And we were sitting here one day and he was demanding that she come and push him on the swing, and we worked with her, and she turned to me and said, I've created this because I've done it his whole life, because I felt for him. I think that's really salient and important, because all of the things that you mentioned are absolutely true too. The guys in the surplus security call it shark music. Our own stuff comes up. There's more to it when there are tricky kids. There's painfulness. So coming back to all of this, when we look at it, it all makes sense. The doing of it is really, really hard. Intellectually, all of whomever's watching this will say, yeah, I get that. And what do I do when things get really hard? Because all I've got is language. That's what it boils down to. I've got a language and a brain that I have to somehow overrule, because its first task is to try and take care of me internally. So we have language available to us. We also have I was just trying to think something else. We have the opportunity, and let me try this. As a psychologist, one of the things that fascinates me is people come and see me about difficulties they have. And often it takes them a lot longer to deal with the difficulties, because when we talk about what might work, they agree with me and then they don't practice. And when the difficulty rises, they lose what we've talked about, because that amygdala takes over and they automatically react the way they have 100 times before. Same as parenting. So what we talk about often is, we're going to talk about some techniques around language and around observation and around thinking about what is my child telling me when things aren't hitting the fan, when the levels in the room are calm. So practice not asking questions when the child's calm. Practice telling them what they're experiencing when it's just there for you.
Yeah, practicing those phrases,
Yeah,
you know.
the language that works.
You can do this now.
Yeah, and then, as you know, here's the fundamental principle. I get what you want. I get it, which might be a want, a need, a feeling. I get it. Not literally those words, but described to the child. And you can, it's time for, or it's hard when you can't have what you want.
So back to the iPad. I know you want it, and it's time for bed.
Yeah.
I know you want it, and it's time for school.
Yeah. I get that you want it. It's time for school. Wow. I get that you want it. It's time for school. Coming back. Don't change language. Let me give you the alternate. No, you can't have your iPad. Wow. I told you no. Wow. How many times do I have to tell you you can't have your iPad? Fairly familiar script. Some kids, and I think lots of kids, thinks we're starting again each time. No, that's one negative response. Oh, here's another first one. Not a sequence of events. Whereas if you hold the line, I know you want it, it's time for school. I know you want it, it's time for school. I know you want it, it's time for school. There's no wriggle room. There's no movement. And particularly for kids on the autism spectrum, we all chuckle at this. The notion that a cheese sandwich cut into squares is different to a cheese sandwich cut into triangles is real. Apply language. No, I told you no. They are two different statements.
They're two different cheese sandwiches.
We're starting again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and that grows. Yeah. That grows into saying we only do it 3 times, because most people will say I told them no 5, 8, 9 times. We're into you're never going to win that one. 3 times. It's got hard. I'm going to help you. Move and take over in a calm, bigger, stronger kind of way. I had a mum say to me, she said to her son, usually people don't try this until it gets really hard, and then they try it and it works, and they think, oh my goodness, I've wasted time. I know you want that, it's time for this. I know you want that, it's time for this. And then she said, it's got hard, I'm going to help you. And she said, her son said, well, what does that mean? She said, I don't know, I'm just coming to help you. And it worked. She chuckled about it. This is a woman who's trained to be a doctor, so it's not someone who is lost for words. It's just in that moment, it's like, I don't really know what I'm doing, I'm just going to do it and see if it works. And she said it worked, because when you move after 3 times, the threat system isn't fully activated. You move after 7, I can't hear, you're a threat, I'm out of here. Whereas the 3rd time, the child is still available. Yeah? So we start to find a way to use that resource of language that says, I get it. And when you say I get it to a child, people say to me, do they understand? Watch this. No. Watch this. I get it. They understand that. Not only that, when you have to stop from the instinctive reaction to say no, which is sponsored by your amygdala, your prefrontal cortex is thinking, what are they wanting? What are they telling me? Oh, you're telling me you want to do that. I get that that's important to you right now. And I'm using lots of words. You don't do this. Oh, I get it. You want to do that. Right. Yeah, I get that you want to do that. Child, oh. And this is going to happen. Oh. When a child hears no, they think we're ready for a negotiation. When they hear no a second time, they think, oh, you don't know how important it is to me. And escalate accordingly. When they hear it a 3rd time, they say, you clearly don't know how important it is. I'm really going to give you heaps. And then we're both out of control. It sounds so simple and so silly until you try it. And it's not about patronising, and it's not about lots of words. It's simple. Get you on the iPad, it's time to bed. And is a word that is a sneaky introduction word, because most people say but. I know you want your iPad, but it's time for bed. You just know them right out of existence. But is a really word. I know you want your iPad and it's time for bed. We'll keep this flow. And what's the study of the derivation of meaning of words? it's not epidemiology, it's not the insect word.
Oh, I know what you mean by the word.
When you look at what the meaning and the derivation of but is, it's essentially saying what I just said I don't really mean. What I really mean is what I'm saying now. Whereas Andy's linking the two things together. And so then you get into this where you can start the life lessons. I know you got cranky and it's not okay to hit, for example. Most people will say it's not okay to hit your brother. By adding the bit before, you're making sure these are available. And I know that sounds really trite. It's saying that if you regulate, these become available because the system is not saying, I've got to get out of here. It's saying, oh, yeah, there's lots and lots of things we start to explore, and this is the hard work.
Yeah.
This is easy.
Yeah, I think probably what changed my clinical practice, switched it around completely, was the ability to remain neutral in these events, right? Because when I could remain neutral and calm, when I got better at waiting, then I could start to think about my own language. And I had that. And I think in classrooms, it's harder, but that really, as kids escalate, you need to de-escalate yourself, because the room will tend to go quiet because other children are waiting to see what's going to happen.
Well, and why are they waiting to see? They're waiting to see what their system is about to tell them to do. I think the other thing to remember too is when you wait, what you do is acknowledge the child has a processing capacity that's different to yours, which is something we completely forget. So the waiting gives them a chance in the best possible place, calm alert, to process the information. And as we work here, it's easy with kids where we say, oh, this isn't really. Whoever's watching, and you try to imagine what it's like to have an IQ of, as a current adult, let's say around 60 IQ points, which is below the line for intellectual disability. Why do I pick that number? Because that number represents the 5-year-old. Because often we talk about age equivalence intellectual disability in adults. And we talk about 60 to 70 as being that, I think it's a bit older than 5. But it's interesting, isn't it, if you start to consider that as people of average intelligence, to try to put yourself in a 5-year-old's place, you've got to drop down that IQ scale quite markedly. And all we do is speedily tell them what's needed and think,
Yeah, and this is, and I know you have to go shortly, it's just 5 past noon. I think this is the other issue with language, right? You're using language, you're the child and you're using language, so I now assume that your language capacity and my language capacity
is the same.
Even though I know that's not true in your written work, in your story recall, anything else.
Sorry.
You got the room book?
We do.
Yeah, we have to go.
Hi.
Sorry.
Hi.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think let's finish this with, this is a parent having a conversation with a child, and they're talking and they're giving them lots of information. I'm being the child. I love it when mum talks to me like this. And it works if I nod, and she talks longer if I tilt my head to the side. And if I smile, I get it for even longer. I'm not listening to what she's saying. I'm enjoying this wonderful beam of love that's coming to me. And she's smiling at me again, I'll nod. And then I walk away. Mum thinks, oh, they listened to me. A few minutes later, how many times do I have to tell you? Yeah, there you got it.